Ty, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. First of all, I just want to say that honestly, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to present with you guys, but also I'm very humbled because truly I really feel that in this group of people, there's plenty for me to learn from each and every one of you, and I already have throughout this event. So it's very, exciting for me to just give a few minutes to be able to share with you some of the observations and findings that I've had in the past couple of years, the past 6 or 7 years, into the field that I am in now, which is really mental health, and a little bit more specifically, helping people who have not made the types of change that they really are seeking through the traditional means. And my mistake was I didn't get Alexander a proper title for my talk in advance, so he filled in the blanks a little bit. But I want to assure you, this is not going to be your typical life coachy, rah, you can do everything presentation, okay? That's not really what I do. That's not really what I'm about. What I am really about is I've been deeply obsessed with the mental health industry as it is currently, people who have mental health challenges, and why it is that it seems that the mental health industry as it is currently is leaving some people behind. And so I know that in any group of any sort of size, I'm not going to ask for a raise of hands by any means, of course, but there's always a couple of people who identify as having mental health challenges, either anxiety, depression, or something along those lines, maybe even just chronic stress or overwhelm. If it's not something that you identify with right now at this chapter of your life, I would bet it's something that you've dealt with at some point in your life. And I'm here to tell you that if you haven't yet, it may be coming. Or you may be, you will be in a position where someone you care about and someone you love may be struggling with this. And so my hope today is really to shift your point of view about what causes these types of mental and emotional issues and what we can really do to alleviate emotional pain that feels chronic and maybe even severe for people, because we actually have a lot more choices to do that than we might think. So to address that properly, what I first want to do is kind of point out the sort of state of affairs, the sort of old paradigm of looking at mental health, if you will. So for the past really century, several decades at least, there's kind of been this old view of mental health. And there's been some kind of competing paradigms, but some common sense sort of attitudes that people have if you interview and ask people about what they believe about things like anxiety, depression, stress, things of that nature. There's really this kind of idea out there that the biggest contributing factor may very well be genetic, that maybe you'll have it, maybe you won't have it. Maybe if your father or your grandmother or so on, it was a part of your family lineage that you're kind of destined to have it. And I see people even kind of absorb that identity. They say, yeah, it's in my family, it's always been in my family, I'm just an anxious person. I was destined to be an anxious person. People will say these types of things very often. There's also this very significant paradigm out there that if you are dealing with anxiety or depression, or if you've dealt with, say, PTSD, overcome some type of trauma, that the ramifications of this are going to be pretty much permanent. There is really kind of that attitude out there that you can do a couple things to mitigate it. Of course, you can use some coping skills, but the general thing that is kind of perpetuated both through therapists and counselors, of course, not everybody's exactly the same, but the common ideal out there is, yeah, this is going to be a part of your life indefinitely. We can help you learn how to live around it and to manage it, but you're certainly not going to be able to live a life without it. And then, of course, that leads to a limited set of options that people have. They sort of believe that the only things that they can really do to take charge of their destiny, their mental health destiny, are to utilize coping skills, and very often people become dissatisfied with them. They can add some value, but they usually are not sufficient to get people to that level of mental and emotional well-being that they're really after. And really the core attitude that people have about these types of issues is that it's just not, frankly, that changeable. And you might be surprised to hear this. Again, some of you maybe have gone through traditional therapy or counseling, maybe some of you have not. But this is honestly, I have, in the past 7 years, going into this field, I've spoken with, consulted with, interviewed probably close to around 10,000 people. I haven't had that many clients. I've had about 500 clients that I've worked with for an integrated, 3-month period or more. But in those conversations, I asked people, what was your experience like with traditional therapy, with counseling? What was that like for you? What was helpful, what was not? And very often, therapists and counselors are kind of putting out this attitude out there of, this is just how it is. Like, you're gonna need to be in therapy indefinitely. You're going to, need to utilize some medication or some breathing exercises. And they kind of go through these standard, like 3 or 4 basic recommendations. But there is a sort of, I call it the mental health glass ceiling, right, that people reach. They sort of believe that they don't have other options outside of that. And it makes sense, right? I mean, here, after all, if you're dealing with anxiety or depression, the logical thing to do is to go and see a licensed psychiatrist or psychologist. And now here you've got a professional who went to school who's now telling you this is how it is. You're more than likely going to believe that. But that creates some challenges, as we'll see. So the thing that got me really fascinated with this, however, was because this was not my story. So for those of you who don't know, I had very severe anxiety and depression for a significant period of time, particularly in my teens, to the point that I was suicidal. I actually had a plan to take my life that was intervened upon by a family member right at the last minute. And so the interesting thing for me was, I was dealing with those significant mental health issues for a pretty prolonged period of time, at least 2 years. It was really, really bad. I would say for several years beyond that, it was still pretty bad. And so I got thrown into the traditional mental health industry, all of the different options and resources that are there. I was hospitalized for close to 2 weeks. I was put on medication right away. I was put into traditional therapy, and did all the sorts of stuff, right? They showed me the ink blots and all these almost sort of silly things that are kind of archaic, but they've become canon, basically. They've become part of tradition in the mental health industry. And none of that stuff worked for me. Honestly, it really didn't. It just wasn't gelling for me, but I really had a very sincere desire to get the anxiety and the depression out of my life. And it wasn't only until well after I had already gone through those traditional means and I got really, really hungry for answers and started looking for them alternatively that I was able to piece together a method that worked for me. And I very truthfully have been anxiety and depression free ever since, over 10 years. That has not been, of course I'm not perfect. I'll have moments of stress. I had a few of those this morning, right? But I've never gotten into that chronic, cyclical sort of place, right? I like to call that uppercase A anxiety, right? Everybody has lowercase a anxiety, and quite honestly, you're meant to be challenged. You're meant to have these experiences where you have fears and some doubts. If you had no fears and doubts, you wouldn't be growing. Right? But what you're not meant to have, I believe, is consistent, cyclical, intrusive thoughts, fears, doubts, pessimisms that limit your life, that keep you from taking the actions that you need to take, that keep you from connecting with people in the way that you want to connect with. So anyway, long story short, I got really obsessed with finding new alternative strategies, lots of trial and error, and I found a way that really worked for me. And what I realized is that my story was atypical. One thing that was fascinating to me is I started to look around at a lot of my adult colleagues and friends, and I realized a lot of people still had really severe anxiety and depression, while I had been depression and anxiety free for a really long time. And that got me thinking, like, why in the world is that the case? There's got to be something different here that's going on. There's got to be something that I did a little differently than they're doing, and maybe that is a model that I could synthesize and that I could share with other people so that they could tap into it. So my whole goal today is to give you a new way of looking at these mental health challenges, whether they're small or chronic or severe or not. And so the first thing I want to share with you is this simple little formula. And I know this sounds so hyperbolic, right, to say there's a formula for happiness, right? But if you'll bear with me and just try this on for size, I think you'll see that this works. It applies. And in all of the 500 cases of people that I've worked with as clients to help them either dramatically reduce or even overcome their anxiety and depression, I've never found an exception to this rule. And so I think this is paramount if we're going to understand the new paradigm of mental health. So I want to submit to you that there is actually a formula for happiness. If you don't like that wording, that's totally okay, but you could fill this in with peace of mind. And I think you guys would all agree, like, think about what it is that you really would love to feel the most in your life. I think we would all agree what we're after is happiness, right? Fulfillment, enrichment, that state of peace of mind where your mind is not constantly spinning and worrying. That's really what we're after. People have different words for it. And what that formula is, I really believe, is when your current life conditions, as in how your life is right this minute, right now, when that matches up with what we call your model of the world, you will feel peace of mind. That's as simple as it is. Now, there's a lot of different synonyms that we could use for the model of the world. The simplest way I could kind of explain this is when your current life conditions match up with your expectations, you feel peace of mind. Okay, and I know that is almost deceptively simple. It's almost so simple that you'd think, well, there's got to be something more to it than that. But just try this on for size for a second. In your life, there's probably one area where you're generally satisfied. It could be your health, it could be your finances, it could be your business, it could be your marriage, it could be your relationship with your kids. Okay, not everybody is fully satisfied in every area of their life, but we all tend to have at least one area we're pretty satisfied with. So if you kind of think about what that would be for you, that area is probably an area that roughly at least matches up with your core expectations of how that area should be. So very often I'll ask people that question, like, what area of your life is satisfying to you? And they'll say, oh yeah, I love my relationship with my kids. And I'll say, well, why do you love your relationship with your kids? They'll say, well, we're so close. We spend so much time together. They ask me for help when they need me. I'm involved in their lives. I know what's going on in their lives. And I'll say to them, gotcha. If those things were not present, right? If they didn't speak with you, if you had no contact with them, if they didn't let you in, how would you feel? And the answer is obvious, right? They would feel total sadness or anxiety. They'd have intrusive thoughts about it. So whenever there's an equilibrium between our core beliefs about how our life should be, we feel peace of mind. Whenever there are core beliefs about how our life should be that are not matching up with our current life conditions, we feel what I would just simplify as anxiety. We feel that perpetual state of our mind trying to balance this equation. We feel our mind striving and circling its own tail, if you will, right? Trying to figure out a way how to make that happen. And so the example I just gave is really obvious, but what about people with really, really, really severe anxiety? What about people who are, say, like having panic attacks, or people who are really deeply depressed, or who have some type of a trauma or something like that? It's not as easy as there's just a couple key expectations that they haven't met. There's got to be something a little deeper going on, and that's exactly true. So to figure out what somebody's core model of the world is, over the years, I've found that there's actually two key questions that I have to ask people. So when I'm speaking with somebody and they're telling me that they feel depressed or anxious, one of the things invariably that we get to is ask them these two key questions, and these two key questions tend to create a bigger breakthrough for them than anything they tend to experience using traditional methods. And I invite you to kind of consider these questions for yourself too, particularly if you're not feeling total peace of mind in your life right now. So the first question is, whose love growing up did you crave more? Your mother's or your father's? Okay, whose love did you crave more, your mother's or your father's? For almost all people, it would be a mother or father. Just for the record, for some of you who were raised, say, with a step-parent, I was. It was actually my stepfather whose love I craved the most. But just contemplate that. It could be a grandmother or something like that, but usually it's going to be mom or dad. And I'll give you a hint. A lot of people think they immediately answer this question with whomever gave them the most love. That's usually the wrong answer, because you usually craved love more from the parent who gave it less freely, if that makes sense to you, right? So whoever love it felt like was tougher to come by, that would almost always be whose love you craved more. Well, why in the world would we care about that? Well, why we would care about that is because when we are young, this is my belief, and this is what my experience has kind of shown me to be true, is that when we're young, the biological core driver of all of us, the survival instinct we all have as children, is to receive the love of our parents in order so that we can survive. We can actually be able to continue to live and we can prosper. We're one of the only animals in the animal kingdom that require another human being putting our needs as a child above their needs in order for us to survive. There's no chance that a human infant can survive out in the wilderness, for example, right? We require a parent to pour into us their love, to put our needs above their own. So I truly believe that the reason human beings got to the pinnacle of the evolutionary ladder is because we have gotten so adaptable at picking up on the little minute signals that our parents give us about who we have to be in order to earn their love. That doesn't exactly sound fair, but I really believe that that's what it is. And so the beginnings of that model of the world that I was mentioning tend to be originated when we start to pick up on those signals of who we can be and who we can't be as a child in order to get love from that parent. And so that's why the second question is so critical, which is, who did you have to be to get that love? And I encourage you to reflect on that now for a moment. Because even for people who don't have, say, anxiety or depression, chances are you are, in your current adult life, living in accordance with a model of the world that was initially shaped by a desire to get love from one of those parents. Even, I'll use myself as an example. So I've always had a drive to make the world a better place, to achieve big things, to make a big impact, and I know many of you share that sort of model of the world. And I remember my stepfather's love was incredibly tough to come by, but one of the few times that he would ever kind of stop the criticism and actually give me praise was when I was helping, I was intervening in a situation to make things better. And so I think I got hooked to that. I got basically addicted to that feeling, trying to pursue that. And we all tend to develop a pattern of chasing after that love in some way. We develop a mental model of who we have to be in order to get that love. Does that kind of make sense to you guys a little bit, hopefully? So now with this, where does emotional pain come from? What causes anxiety, depression, or things of that nature? Well, to make it simple, I've kind of found that there are kind of 6 main roles, or I like to call them the 6 archetypes. There are basically kind of 6 main personality types that tend to cause emotional pain. These are kind of roles that we make believe that we have to live in alignment with in order to get that love, right? And not everyone identifies with every one of these, but I know many of you are going to identify with at least one of these. And I've kind of put them in, sort of order of which ones tend to create the most anxiety or sadness and depression down to the bottom, but it's not always cut and dry like that. The first one would seem obvious to you, which is the perfectionist. If you're not one of these people, you know somebody like this, right? Where every little detail's got to be exactly right, or they have an incredible desire, they have an incredible tendency to find flaws in themselves that other people don't even see. This tends to occur when they had at least one parent who seemed almost impossible to please. So, they came home, they brought home an A on their paper. Hey mom, check it out, I got an A on my paper. They go, well, why didn't you get an A+? Right? Or they spend all this room like cleaning their room, and then the mom goes, oh, I think I found a piece of paper right here on your floor. What's going on with this? Right? So I see some of you guys can relate to this, right? And so what that ends up creating, because again, remember, think about, being in the body and the mind of a child, right? A body and the mind of the child, we all know that feeling when your parent is disappointed with you. It's the worst feeling you could possibly imagine, right? And it feels like emotional death. So we'll do anything we can think of in order to avoid that. So what do? Some people develop a pattern that says, I know, I've got the solution. I'll find the flaws in myself first. And that way I can mitigate them so nobody else will find those flaws and no one will find a flaw in me, so I'll never be seemed to be not good enough. And if I'm never not good enough, so for many people, they will start to search out flaws in themselves first because they think that will enable them to feel good enough. But of course, that's an unsustainable strategy. This ends up causing people to find flaws that don't even exist, because when you search for something in the mind, you will find it, even though it may not be what it is. The second one is the achiever, right? So if you brought home that A+ and your parents go, oh my gosh, that's so awesome, that's so great. Or you score the winning goal in soccer and your parents, it seems like that's when you get the disproportionate amount of attention and love and praise. The mind can make a connection and say, if I achieve things, then I get love. So I know what I'll do, I'll be an achiever. Right? Same thing with the pleaser. This is a particularly poisonous one, right? When basically you had a parent or both where the expectation that they had of you, who they thought you had to be, was whatever would make them happy, right? What you had to do or be in the situation, whatever would make them feel peace of mind. And so that could be a moving target, right? And in fact, that's what then causes people to have this anxious tendency of constantly trying to think, what is this person thinking of me, and this person thinking of me, and what does this person expect of me? And in adulthood, they start to do that with their peers or their partners or what have you. The caretaker, this is a very interesting one. There's a story, a young woman I worked with many years ago. She was in her mid to late 20s, I think like 28, and she had lived with her mother her whole life, and she had a fiance, and she really wanted to marry her fiance and move out, but they had delayed the wedding at least 3 times. But she really loved her fiance. Come to find out, the mom had undergone a severe accident and a divorce. And basically the mom kind of told the daughter, like, I'm so glad you're here to take care of me. So the daughter created this mental role in her mind that she had to be a caretaker for her parent. And so she was torn. She felt this anxiety because her model of the world was telling her 2 things. Right? I need to go start my life with my husband, but I need to take care of my mom, right? So that creates anxiety. The 5th one is the strong kid. This comes when you're told and you're reinforced for not showing emotion. When you're told like, hey, suck it up, right? This was a big thing with my stepfather, right? Like quit Girl Scouting, right? Is what he would always say. Or, men hear this a little bit more than girls, but it is out there for women as well, right? This idea that you need to be emotionless, you need to not be weak, you need to be strong, right? And that can be very problematic in adulthood when all of a sudden we have to accept the fact that we're going to be vulnerable, we're going to need help from time to time, and that's okay. And then finally, the controller. This one tends to occur when people go through what we call a SEE, or a significant emotional event, like they're driving and they get in a major car accident that they weren't anticipating, or everything is all well and good and healthy and you're 28 years old and then you get diagnosed with breast cancer, for example. Or who knows, right? Something totally unexpected occurs that you didn't anticipate and it surprised you. And your brain goes, man, that was so painful and that was so out of left field. I didn't see that coming. I know I need to make sure I prevent pain by anticipating the next bad thing that's going to happen to me. And that creates this mental pattern where your mind constantly anticipates something bad happening even when you're totally safe. And this is what tends to create a lot of panic attacks, anxiety attacks. Okay? So these are kind of the 6 main ones that become really problematic. And there are kind of large factors that influence our model of the world. Culturally, for example, there's different expectations on men and women depending on what country you grew up in or what culture you were raised in. Many of you guys can relate to that. National values, right? So for example, like in America, the American dream, right? Being entrepreneurial, being hardworking, making something of yourself. Those tend to influence our expectations of who we think we have to be. Gender roles, right? Which have shifted from decade to decade, right? But those can heavily influence who we think we have to be. And then, especially in the nuclear family, for example, in my family, they owned their own business, and it was kind of this big assumption that everybody needs to stay in the family business. And that was a big conflict I felt in my model of the world because I didn't want to do that. Right? So many of you guys can relate to that. You get expectation from not just your parents, but from your nuclear family about who you need to be and how you need to be. And as one example, I wanted to compare Japan and Cyprus. This is how you end up with a situation where, say, Japan is one of the countries in the world with the highest suicide rate. And a big reason for that is because in that country, there are these big values of like guilt and shame and honor. And it's a very heavy belief system in that part of the world. Whereas in Cyprus, it's one of the happiest countries. If you look at all the statistics and the model of the world, the cultural values are very different. That's just one kind of example. So there are big things that influence our model of the world. So this brings us to a little mental model that I came up with a couple years ago that I just wanted to share with you guys because it's so simple, everybody can relate to it. And my sincere hope is that you'll be able to take something from this to actually create a little bit more fulfillment and happiness and peace of mind in your own life. And hopefully maybe even be able to help somebody who's going through something more substantially challenging mental health-wise. And I like to call it the game of life. So think about it like this. Everyone's played a board game at some point in their life, right? I'm going to use Monopoly for an example. And when you play Monopoly or whatever board game is your particular choice, there are a couple elements of every single game. First of all, there's a goal. And very often there's a series of goals, right? There's something you need to do first and do second and then third, and then eventually you win. All right, so there's a series of goals. And then of course the other important component is there's a set of rules. There's a set of things that you can do to win, and there's a set of things that you cannot do. If you do those things that you're not supposed to do, you either lose points or you just flat out lose. Well, what I really believe is that, metaphorically of course, we all are playing our own internal game of life, if you like. Right? And so what I mean by that is we all have, whether we know it or not, a set of goals, a set of things that we think we have to do, or a type of person we think we have to be in order to have fulfillment, right? And that's kind of our core model of the world. We also have a set of rules, right? A set of rules about who we definitely can't be or what we definitely can't do that would cause us to lose points, for example. And what I found is that the more winnable your game of life is, the more peace of mind and happiness and less mental health issues you have. The less winnable your game of life is, the more issues you're going to have. So think of it kind of on a spectrum. Think of on one side of the spectrum, you've got the ultimately winnable game. Every time you play, you win. It may not be the same exact thing every single time, but every single time you play, you come away from it feeling successful. You're like, man, I just crushed that, I won. That would be an ultimately enriching game, right? On the other side of the spectrum, imagine a game where you cannot win. Like every single time you try to play and win, you just cannot seem to do it. And many of you guys have had this experience, maybe your family board game nights, where you're playing Monopoly or something like that, and you just want to flip the board off the table because you're like, all right, you're cheating. I know you're cheating. Like, there's no way I can win this freaking game. I'm done. And you decide that you want to walk away, right? Well, what happens when you're playing a mental game of life that you feel like you can't win? You also feel like you want to walk away, if you get what I mean. And so very often people are playing a game of life that they don't realize they've set up subconsciously that is unwinnable. And there are different factors that contribute to the winnability or the unwinnability of that game. And these are the things that I've found are really important. Out of all of the things that I'm sharing with you today, I would say this is probably one of the ones I would really hope that you can kind of take with you. If you want to take a picture, you're more than welcome to. But this is the one this is kind of my checklist. Okay, so when I have a client who's got emotional pain of some kind, whether it's severe or it's just kind of showing up here or there, like at their job or something like that. This is the checklist I always use. And I'm always able to figure out where that source of the real problem is, and then a problem well defined is half solved, right? Then we can figure out a solution for it. So these are what I believe to be the 7 ways that we make the game of life painful. So the very first one is you can have a difficult goal, right? Like playing tic-tac-toe compared to playing the game Risk feels very different, doesn't it? Tic-tac-toe is a little bit easier, right? It's a little bit more easy to get that feeling of like, oh, I won, as opposed to the game of Risk, because the goal is just different. It's one is more difficult and one is a little bit easier. Just in the same way that if somebody's goal, their model of the world tells them, I need to be perfect, or I need to be achieving things all the time, or I need to please every single person that I interact with, or I need to take care of everybody else's problems. Those are all very, very difficult goals. Do you follow me? Those are all very, very difficult games to win, only by the fact that the goal is just frankly difficult. Compared to someone who's got incredible fulfillment, peace of mind, happiness, if you get to know these people, and maybe you are one of these people, I guarantee you, whether you know it or not, you play the game of life with a simple set of goals. Some people have simple sets of goals like improve my body every day, improve my marriage every day, improve my business every day. If I just move the needle a little bit, then I'm winning. That's a more winnable goal. So there are some really, really difficult goals, and those are the ones we just covered a few minutes ago. The second one is very interesting, and that is that another way to lose, another way to have a difficult game of life, is to have misaligned goals, or goals here I'm using as a synonym for the word values. So things that you put as different, that you place importance on different things. So for example, let's say one person believes that they need to be incredibly successful in their life. They need to go build big things. They need to go do big things. But they also believe that they can never fail or make a mistake. Well, now we've got a problem, because on the way to achieving very, very big, great things, you are going to make mistakes. So imagine playing that board game where as soon as you get very, very close to scoring a point, you lose a point. That would be ultimately aggravating, anxiety inducing, and over a long enough period of time, it'd be depressing. Right? So people very often have conflicts, just like the woman I was telling you about before. She wants to go live her life with her husband, but she also wants to take care of her mom. That's a conflict, what we call a values conflict or a values crisis. And can any of you guys relate to the concept of self-sabotage? Any of you guys ever done this? You have a goal, you're like making a little bit progress towards the goal, and then all of a sudden you seem to pull back, and you're like, why the hell did I just pull back? Why did I do that? Well, this is because we have conflicting beliefs about what we have to have. One that I had, sounds so silly, but I've had one that I've dealt with for a long time, which is I want to be really successful, but then I've also thought, well, if I'm really successful, I don't think my family's going to like that. I don't think they'll approve of me because they're kind of more common folk a little bit. So that was a conflict for me. I would get some success and then I would kind of mute it. I would tell my parents like, oh yeah, well, it's not really that big a deal, right? When, I was doing things that I was really proud of. So that's misaligned goals, conflicting goals. So, I'm sorry, I went out of order here. I was just sharing conflicting goals. So misaligned goals, what does this mean? Well, if you had a board game, let's say Monopoly, right? If you're gonna play Monopoly, we all know how you win. First you get money, then you get property, then you get a monopoly, you charge a bunch of rent, your family hates you, and then you win. That's how Monopoly goes. That's the order, that's the sequence of how things go. And it's meant to be that way. But if you had to get a monopoly first, it wouldn't work, right? The game just wouldn't work. It'd be incredibly challenging. There'd be no way for you to do it. You have no financial resources in the game to do this. So people have misaligned values, misaligned goals all the time. I see this all the time. I'll tell you the most classic example I see is somebody's dealing with relationship trouble. And they tell me, yeah, I'm really, really having a tough time in relationships. And they tell me that the pattern that they've had is they date, they get close to somebody, it gets to a certain level of depth or intimacy, somewhere maybe around like 6 to 9 months. And then all of a sudden there's like a little trigger that's hit and the pain level seems too high and they break it off. And they decide they're gonna start all over with somebody else. And what they didn't realize is that they had two goals. They wanted love, they wanted, connection and love. But what they also wanted was certainty, right? That's one of the big reasons we go to relationships. But think about this. Imagine somebody who's valuing love number one. That's their number one top priority and value. Like, I'm just going to give love and receive love and be loving. That's their number one goal. And then I'll worry about certainty later. Certainty will come or it won't come. There will be times where we're certain and we're not certain, but whatever. If I just love number one, my relationship will be okay. That would be one person. Another person, imagine if we flipped that and somebody said, no. I need to be totally, completely certain about my relationship first. I need to have no doubts. I need to make sure that you talk to me the way I want to be talked to. You treat me the way I need to be treated. You don't trigger me. You don't upset me. You don't, once it gets to a certain level of depth and I feel vulnerable, it can never be rough around the edges. It needs to feel safe all the time. And only when I feel certain first, then I will let love out and I will let love in. Well, I think you guys could all see that second model of the world becomes an infinitely harder game to play just because of the order. So very often what I'll help people do is reorder their values. Like if you put love number one, you've got a totally different marriage. Or if you put growth number one instead of perfection, totally different life. So that's one way to make the game of life easier. Number 4 is you can have too many rules. This is the one that we can all kind of relate to. So if you've got, again, tic-tac-toe versus risk, right? One only has a couple rules, one has, I don't even know how many, it's too many. They're complicated. All other things being equal, I would rather play a game with only, say, 5 rules compared to 50, wouldn't you? Well, some people are playing the game of life with 50 or 100 rules. When I have this process I take my clients through where we figure out all of their rules, and the more rules you have, the more anxiety you will have, I can promise you that. So what will happen is people will say, well, I'm not feeling love in my marriage. I say, okay, well, what has to happen for you to feel loved? And to kind of spare you the middle part, what we end up getting to is that's a big long list. They can never raise their voice. They need to text me at least 5 times a day. They need to call me. We need to have a date night every single week. They need to do this. They need to do this. They can never do this. They can never do that, right? It's a big long list of rules they didn't even know they had, but they were in their subconscious. So the more rules you have, the more complicated it gets. Number 5, conflicting rules. Same basic concept. So people will very often have things like, you need to, one that I remember from a client recently was, you need to always be honest and direct with me, one rule. Another rule, you have to never upset me, right? This is true. This is how our human brains work. We have conflicting beliefs, and that's why people like me have a job, is to find those conflicts and help people iron them out. 6, we can have rules for others. If we have too many rules that rely on other people as opposed to our own actions, we're screwed. Imagine playing a board game where it has nothing to do with what you do. Doesn't matter whether you roll the dice or go around the board or whatever. The only way you win is if everybody else around the table does exactly what they're supposed to do according to your rule book. But meanwhile, guess what? They don't have a copy of your rule book. They're playing by their own. That would be infinitely anxiety-inducing. That would be even depressing. But people live their life this way. I even have people who will say things like, I'll ask them, what would it really take for you to be happy? And I'll have people tell me there'd have to be no traffic on the highway. It's like, okay, cool. Well, you're on the wrong planet, unfortunately. It's just not going to work that way. We have to rewrite your rules. We can't expect life to match up with an unrealistic set of rules. You guys follow me? We have to rewrite the game of life so that you can actually win it more often. And then 7 is that there will be rules that you can't control. That example I just gave would perfectly fit the bill. Or, I can't be happy unless it's sunny outside. Things like that. Or this is why I don't watch the news. When people say, well, I can't be happy if there's war and conflict going on in the world. You're on the wrong planet, unfortunately. It's just not going to happen, okay? So, hope that makes sense to you guys. Moving on, I wanted to simplify this a little bit for you because may feel like a lot, and I want to simplify it and distill it so that you can take it away and use this, right? And so to kind of sum this up, I really feel like there are 2 main unwinnable games that people play and that become very problematic. And in contrast, there are 4 winnable games that we all can choose to play instead. So if you feel any discomfort or emotional pain in your life, I guarantee you it's coming from one or both of these 2 right here. And if you're feeling fulfillment in your life, it's going to come from one or more of these 4. So the first one is when we try to have a game that's about certainty, control, predictability, continuity. It's all got to go this way or else. That becomes problematic because that means you only have one way of winning and a million ways of losing. The second way is if you're trying to prove that you're good enough. All those things about pleasing and achieving and being perfect are perfect examples. When what you're really trying to do is you're creating this artificial measuring stick in your mind of who you think you have to be, and you're comparing yourself to that. That will never work. That's an unwinnable game. But the winnable games are these 4. Right? And I really believe that as human beings, it's not that we have many limits, but one of the limits we have is that if you're going to find fulfillment, it's going to come from a combination of these 4, I can guarantee you. There's a million ways to do it, and that's the cool thing. One of those is to prioritize a game that's about variety, stimulus, surprise, mystery, romance, curiosity. You can get this from reading books, doing obstacle courses, doing burpees even, right? All sorts of different stuff, right? You can give variety a lot of different ways, and that's why it's a very winnable game. There's a lot of ways to win. You can do it through pursuing connection and love. There's a million ways to do this. Through a conversation, through a honeymoon, through a wedding, through reading a book, through making a phone call, through all sorts of things. You can do it through growth. The reason why growth is a winnable game is because it's pretty much impossible to be on planet Earth and not grow. You're going to end up growing whether you want to or not. So if you start to prioritize it and you put it especially over comfort, don't try to smile too big, Lucho, then you'll actually win. This will be a winnable game for you. And then 6 is contribution, because there's a million ways to contribute. There's no contribution too small or too large, so long as you're not doing the whole, am I contributing enough thing, which is making it about the ego, okay? So challenges with the old view, to sum everything up. The old view of mental health right? It defines the problem, I believe, in unsolvable terms. It's the pathological model. It's more concerned with, let me listen to you for 10 minutes. Oh, yeah. What you're describing matches up with this diagnosis in this book. Let me give you this diagnosis. Now you have a label, and now you're going to have this probably for the rest of your life. And it creates a very bleak vision of someone's future, unfortunately, which is one of the very things that causes anxiety and depression. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I really believe it doesn't address the root of the issue, because it's not, when you give someone medication or you just tell someone, hey, go meditate, right? But they believe that they have to be perfect or else they are not good enough to receive love. It's not getting to the root of the problem. You follow me? It's not really getting to the real core. And I think that that's really the thing that we need to change. That's my real passion, is to change this conversation about mental health. The other problem too, I'll let you know, this is not always comforting to hear. It's not always easy to hear, but it is the truth. And that is that the old model of giving a label is actually comforting. Because when you get a label, you go, oh, okay, I understand. Oh, it's not me. Oh, it's not something I can change. That actually feels good temporarily, because now you externalize the responsibility for learning how to master your own mind. But in the long term, it robs us of freedom. And the new view of mental health issues, I really believe, is this, that yes, anxiety and depression exist, but they are conditioned patterns of thinking and belief. They don't necessarily have to be permanent. It's not that they're unchangeable and permanent. It is absolutely possible to improve or even overcome, depending on someone's willingness to learn the laws of the human brain. Just like I really believe that just about anyone on this planet can be generally physically fit. Different people might need different strategies and plans. But there are laws of mental health, just like there are laws of physical health. And if we live in alignment with those, then we can be much better off. And the way that we do that is we have to do the real inner work, particularly addressing the issues with our model of the world. So thank you so much for your time. And if you guys want to find me, you can do so at mentalhealthcoaching.com. Thank you.